Hey folks, it's James, and in part 3 of this 3-part series, we're going to use Procreate to design and render a one-point perspective of the great room we designed in part 1. So get out your iPad, download the free Procreate file that comes with this lesson in the description below, and get ready for part 3, designing and rendering a one-point perspective without keyboard and mouse. In part 1 of this 3-part series, we designed and rendered a floor plan of an open living and dining room in a barn-like space. Then we added tone and texture to give the drawing character and define the materials. In part 2, we used that same plan to project and render a combined elevation and section of the space, adding a source of daylight streaming through the windows and applying tone and texture to give character to all the materials. And in today's part 3, we're going to use that same plan and elevation to create a rendered perspective by eye, using the elevation and plan together along with Procreate's Perspective Drawing Assist to project the space in 3 dimensions, then render the room complete with sunlight, shade, and shadows. So this is to remind you of the final look we're going for, and before this phase it looked like this with just tone and no big daylight, shade, and shadow layer. And before this, the rendering looked like this with just the line work. So for those of you who want to see how all this came together, just from this plan and this section elevation, and especially for those of you who want to draw along with this exercise, let's go back to the beginning now and see how all this happened. So for all of you joining us for the first time and those of you coming back, the first thing you're going to do is create a new canvas, hit that little plus sign in the gallery, and we're going to make it 17 inches wide by 11 inches tall and 300 dpi. Then we're going to go back to the gallery and export JPEGs of the images we made in the 2 previous exercises, the plan and the section elevation. We're going to save those files to the files on our iPad so that they're easy to find later to export or import into the new document. Now we've imported these documents and you can see them in the layers menu, and the first thing I'm going to do is work with the plan and try and figure out what view we're going to take here. Now I know I want to focus on the fireplace, and I want to be back here at the top of this conversation group, and I'm going to do a quick freehand sketch of what I want to see. It shows the roof, the fireplace, and these 2 sectional sofas. And I'm going to probably be sitting rather low, or maybe it'll be at eye height. So I figure out where the vanishing point is going to be in the room, and that looks about right. I can frame it later and see only as much of the conversation area as I want to see. So now that I know where the perspective is going to be taken from, I'm going to get rid of all of the rest of this drawing, and I'm only going to keep the walls and the mullions, so I have those as a reference later in the drawing. And I'm basically going to select it with the rectangular selection mode and clear all the rest of this stuff out. So I'm going to go down to the menu here and invert the selection, then do the old 3-finger swipe and get rid of the rest of that drawing. Now I go back in and I have to rearrange the layers a little bit because I'm going to make the plan and the section exactly the same size, so they're going to work together. And I'm going to do the same thing with the section. I'm going to trim it a little. I'm going to resize it until it lines up perfectly. And I'm pretty much ready to go at this point. So now I'm going to switch to working with just the section, and I'll turn the plan layer off. And I'll come to the top of the stack, and you've all seen me do this before. I'm going to add opaque white and then reduce the opacity so it acts like a sheet of tracing paper. And my goal here is I want to get some heights on this section so I know where to put the horizon line and I know the relative size of things. So let me first of all group those 2 together to keep them tied together so I can enlarge them. I need to make it a little bigger so I can start the perspective. And I'm going to come here and find, or rather remind myself of that 22-foot dimension. So if that's 22 feet, where does that put my eye level? And there are a couple of ways you can figure this out. One that I like to use, kind of a shortcut, is to go back and import one of the scales that I've made and I bring this in, and now I can adjust. That scale, by the way, comes in at actual size for this 11 by 17 document. So that's a real 12-inch long architect scale. Now I'm going to move the section and plan group so they line up on the 0 mark of the 1/4 inch part of the scale. And that's not because the perspective is going to be in 1/4 inch, but that's because that's the most convenient scale to use in this case. So here you can see I'm going from 0 to 22 on the left side, and I'll bring that back up so you can see it. And if this is 22 feet, now all I have to do is take the scale to 90 degrees, run it up here, set 0 at the ground level of the room, and I can track up here and find 5 feet. So again, this is important because it's going to help me get a sense for how big things are as I'm developing this perspective. So now I'm going to mark the center of the room, and where the center of the room crosses that eye level will be my 1-point perspective vanishing point. So I'm on a roll now. I'll move that whole group, that diagram plus that plan and that section over, and I will go into the canvas menu and go to edit the guide, and I'll make sure it's selected in perspective. I'll make these lines as visible as I can for you here, and just plop that perspective line right in that center we created. Now I can create a new layer and begin to just kind of lay in the basics of this fireplace wall, that plane in the drawing. You can see that these walls will actually go beyond that plane back to that dining room back there. But for now, let me just lay in the most basic lines. I'm doing a little scrubbing here just to see, did I get this right? Will the sectional sofas look good there? And this is a big theme in all of these videos, you know. Just, you really can do some very ugly scratching to kind of get yourself started. Not everything has to be beautiful, and the amazing iterative capacity of Procreate makes sure that you can use enough layers and make this perspective beautiful at the end. But in this phase, it's just about diagramming. It's about visualizing the subject. So I bring up that plan again, and I check out, try to remember what's in plan and what I'm going to be locating here. Now here's the big trick. This plan, if I can trim it down so it's not very unwieldy, I can save only this part of the floor plan and go into transformation mode and stretch this part of the floor plan to match that basic rectangle that I created when I laid out the perimeter of this room. So that's what we're doing now. We're going to go in here, we're going to go into the transformation menu, select freeform, and I'm just going to squeeze this entire thing into that line of the fireplace wall, lines up with that horizontal red line that I drew in there, showing the line of the perspective diagram I've created. Now this takes some getting used to. You're going to push and pull and stretch, and I probably should have cut off the dining room back there. I don't really need it, but I will not always do the most logical thing, and I'll just keep stretching. What I'm trying to do is to get the plan that I edited and selected to stretch so that the 4 corners of the plan meet the 4 corners of the bounding box I created with the red lines before. And it is tricky, but you will get used to it. It's kind of fun. If you pull one side, sometimes another side will go out of whack, but you'll get very good at this with a little practice. And let me just turn that bounding box blue now so you can see. And so we're pretty close. Here's the red edge of the room aligned with the blue line of the bounding box I created. And this is going to allow me to locate not only the furniture, but also the mullions and the doors, and anything else that appears in the floor plan can now be located in perspective. So that looks pretty good to me. I'll rearrange the layers a little bit so everything's below that layer of tracing paper I created, the semi-opaque layer 5, layer of white. I'm going to go back and work on the section now. Now this is not necessary, but I'm going to get fancy here. I'm going to see if I can select these back walls that are associated with the dining room in the next room. And I'm going to independently select and copy those. And then I'll push them back so that by the time I get to the rendering and I'm rendering that back wall, they will be back there ready to help me trace them, and that should save some time. And I'll clean up the part of the elevation that is blocking the other part, and we should be good to go. I'm about ready to start estimating my vertical height. So I'll locate that horizon line again at 5 feet. And the way this goes is that I can estimate the distance from the ground to 5 feet. And if I go half of that distance, I know that half of 5 feet or half of 60 inches is 30 inches. If I go a quarter of that distance, I know it's 15 inches. And I can use a combination of my experience with the size of FF&E and the size of architectural elements. And that's an experience that everyone should be working on if you're not already practicing that. But I can combine that experience with just eyeballing these proportions and start to create what is really a kind of section in the very foreground of this rendering, a section of the different things that I'm cutting through so that I know how big they're going to be, and I know that when I finish drawing them, they will be accurate. Because what good is a perspective by eye if it's not accurate, or at least proportionally accurate? We're not going for photorealism here. We're going for emotion and excitement and all of the things that hand drawing can convey. But accuracy is should be second nature to you if you're really designing and making sure that your designs work in the real world. So here this coffee table is going to be about 15 inches high. You can see where I've got the seat of the sectional at 15 inches. Now, sometimes you can also kind of get stuck and overly analytical. So I've decided to go back in here and do a quick freehand mock-up of this whole perspective again. Don't ask why. Like I said, it doesn't always make sense. But you kind of invent these things as you go. The principles stay the same, but your actual working method for developing these things will be different. So here I'm once again carving out the major elements in the room. Now I'm going to go into hyperdrive here on you because this is really a pretty boring phase of the drawing. It's your opportunity to trace everything in a very rough way. I call it my design layer, because you're adding the various accessories that are going to make this rendering even more lively when you're done here. So you can see me adding pillows and double checking some proportions and suggesting what might be seen outside. And it's just your time to get familiar with what you're going to do and come up with some ideas for how you're going to make this rendering personal to you and personal to the client. So again, it's in this red freehand phase that you really are completing the design, finishing the design, adding the accessories, and it's all to build up to, we're getting close to the end, and we're going to make a drafted perspective version of this freehand red drawing. So I'll go back in. I have created another layer with that semi-opaque layer of trace underneath it. I'm going to switch to some blue lines now, and in Perspective Drawing Assist mode, make sure you turn that on in your layer. I am now going to draft out the actual architectural elements of this room. So this is where I can really take the time. I can make doors look a little more realistic and show the thickness of the doors, show the edge of the glass in the doors, show the thickness of the columns of the room. I can show how one door is actually in a plane behind another door. These are all the little three-dimensional tricks that are going to fool the eye and make your perspective very believable to the observer. But the thing is, you have to believe it first. You have to believe that these little extra efforts you're going to put in really do add up to something. And I am here to tell you that they do, because take a good objective look at this right now, okay? It's just a bunch of lines. There's no character. They look to be extraneous, unnecessary lines. But you'll see here, as I speed this up into hyperdrive again, you'll see how these begin to add up and create this room that fools the eye into kind of falling into it. It also kind of fools you as the renderer, because the Perspective Drawing Assist makes it so easy to create this phase of the drawing that you almost feel like you are a human version of SketchUp or a human version of Rhino. But there is, of course, one very important difference, and those of you who know this channel have heard this a lot, those of you that are new to this channel, and that difference is, look how crude this line drawing is. Look how sloppy those pillows are. Look how strange that connection is in that bubble lamp above the coffee table. Look how crude these quick lines are that I'm putting in for bowls and accessories, and just using the eraser to take out lines that cross each other, adding lines that I've forgotten earlier. All of this is, in a way, so counter to the overly slick, photorealistic rendering that we're all used to. But the whole point of these layers that we're doing in building this drawing up from the most basic early perspective layout to the tone and the shadow is that all of these layers and all these phases work together and multiply off of each other, so that you really can avoid perfectionism and just end up with character and poetry and the sense that this is a human artifact that is engaging a part of the brain that the photorealistic renderings could never engage. So for the most part, we're done with our line drawing. Now let's convert it to black and white. And we will go in above here with a new layer, and let's start creating some tone. So remember, I want this tone layer under the line drawing layer so that the tones aren't interfering or diminishing any of the line work. And I tried this tone drawing a couple of different ways. I tried selecting and filling with tone, and that seemed like a lot of work. And I just finally opted for this. Of course, leave it to me. I opted for the crudest possible form of tone, partly to perform that magician's trick again and show you that it really doesn't matter. But again, keep an eye as we go through this, and I'll speed it up to hyperdrive, but just look how crude this stuff is, right? It looks like a bad drawing you might have done in third grade, and nowhere near the kind of either handcrafted grain or the watercolor renderings that some of us have seen and worked on in the past. But I'll just keep laying this in. It's almost like a thin magic marker, because really all I'm doing is trying to develop light and shadow, some idea for differentiating the planes one from another. So the face of this beam is probably 4 inches from the face of that door. And this beam in the back, well, I've even forgotten a line here, but this beam in the back is going to be a different shade than the wall. And I'll go through this whole drawing. Let's take it up to hyperdrive again. And just make sure there is some tone on every surface, and that tone will change from adjacency to adjacency. I'm going right over the lines. That would be a crime in my first grade class. I don't know about yours. I am going to add in some basic shadows. We're going to get to that big shadow later that we saw in the beginning of the tape, but I'll throw in a few shadows that I know are going to be fun later on. I'll show some reflections on this chrome lamp here. Add a little more density to some of the surfaces. This feels good. It's hard to stop yourself. Once you start with the magic marker, it really is a lot of fun. Of course, it's not like real magic marker because you can go back in and erase anything. And I'm using the selection tool here to erase things and clean things up. I'm even using the selection tool now, where I wasn't earlier, to add some tone. I'm not sure if I did in this case, but it's an option. And you'll get to the end here and I'll see, well, yeah, I didn't use the selection tool after all. I came back with the magic marker, and I'm popping some things. There are different ways you can go here. You can add new layers to try and darken things, and if you don't like that, you can get rid of that. I forgot to add these logs, and logs are always a great addition. So I'll come back in and play with some different brushes, see if it makes sense to add some texture outdoors, but that I think is too distracting. You just slowly work it, and you've got all the time in the world. Nobody's watching you. You can use Perspective Assist to add some tone on the boards, and that will automatically align with the drawing you've done before. You can add Perspective Assist, which is going to allow you to make straight horizontal lines. So I get these brick or these tiles on the chimney to lay in there very quickly. And I'm also using the trick of drawing and holding a line so that it snaps straight, and that allows me to add some depth to these trusses up above. So with the basic material tones and material character in place, it's time to create that fantastic big shadow I always love to create. But before I could create the big shadow, I had to make some decisions about how the daylight would come in to have the best effect. And in this case, I wanted the shadows to help define some of the more important features of the room and help pop out the furniture. So I created a temporary layer at the top of the stack, and I used my go-to #1 technical pen with some red ink, and I tested and plotted and basically scribbled out some different light angles to see which I liked the best. And what I ended up going with was for a strong sense of daylight coming across the room from the doors on the left, sweeping across the back wall and the exposed chimney stone, so I could use the dramatic angle of the light to highlight the fireplace and the mantle and the paintings in the background and the tchotchkes on the mantle, and basically attract the eye of the viewer and pull their interest back to this fireplace, which is, after all, the real story of the room. Once the area of light and shadow was plotted, I created a new layer for the shadow. I set the blending mode to multiply, and this is very important because you Photoshoppers out there will know that multiply blending mode will allow you to still see all the detail under the shadow. And then I use the selection tool in freehand mode to select the area to be filled, complete with all the ins and outs of the plot I made in red ink. And I won't lie, it does take a certain amount of patience and practice to remember what areas will be in shade or shadow and what areas will be in light. But once you make this selection, Filling it in is such a rush and immediately takes the rendering to that whole new level that you saw earlier in the segment. It's not always easy, nor is there any need to create this overall daylight effect all on one layer, but you do want to keep the final effect all together. So what I do is just make sure the layer is at full opacity, and then if I have to add other areas, I add what I want to incorporate. In this case, the shade and shadow that falls across the sofa and falls on the floor under these tables, and just add it to that same layer. That way, when I do adjust the opacity of the black shadows, I can make sure that they're all getting the same treatment. So in this last part, I'm demonstrating how you can use the selection tool in Procreate to apply a large area of tone over the whole image, then essentially take away or erase from that area to create a dramatic light and shadow effect that creates a sense of daylight and makes the whole perspective come alive in a very believable way. That layer of shade and shadow can then be isolated on its own, and if I hold down the layer button on the right, you can see how what started as a single selected area of black has been lightened and erased in places to bring the white of the foreground or the white of the background forward and to create the energy and movement in the rendering. Once again, take a good long look at how crude this rendering is when you really get down and look at the individual parts. Lines overlapping lines, lines that haven't been completed, combinations of freehand lines crisscrossing with drafted lines, tone that looks incomplete and scratchy. And yet this is the point that I want to make over and over again to all of you, that the layers work together and that hand drawing derives much of its charm from exactly this kind of imperfection. To go deeper and really master Procreate, remember to check out the online courses I offer in the description below. To keep learning how Procreate takes your hand designing and drawing skills to the next level, tap on this image, and I'll see you in the next lesson.